See a number of familiar faces. How many of y'all have been to one of these programs before? All right. Who's new? All right, good for you. If you haven't ever signed in before, we'd appreciate getting your name and email address so that we can tell you things like when and where the next program will be and what it will be. A couple of y'all asked about the museum opening again and when that's going to happen, and that's still being worked out. And in the meantime, we've kind of held back on planning the next one of these, but within the next week or two, we ought to know what we're doing, and we'll email everybody and let you know. Okay, well, I'm Brad Worthen, and this is the portable noon debrief, which the museum's been having for a number of years. Used to call it Lunch and Learn, and people started noticing there was no lunch, so gave it another name.
Better than no learning.
Huh?
Better than no learning.
Yeah, better than that. Of course, these are normally held at the South Carolina Confederate Relic Room and Military Museum, which is the building's undergoing some changes, and the museum is taking this opportunity to restore all of the artifacts that are in the back room. How many thousand?
Oh, it's many more than what I quoted from the move,
Yeah.
because the acquisition of Corky Huey's collection in between. So I don't even know.
So
I don't work in collection anymore.
I understand that's going pretty well, but the museum has been in various portions and in various ways flooded during all this work a couple of times, so that's setting everything back. Our speaker, so far in all of these that we've had at the library, we're very grateful to Richland Library for providing this beautiful room, which is way better than what we've got at the museum. You can actually see, you don't have to sit behind a pillar. Anyway, so far, this is the third one of these. We had one in June, one in August. The speaker each time has been Joe Long, who's the curator of education at the museum, and that makes it easy for us because Joe knows how to do these things. And but at some point, we'll get back to having our guest speakers who are like veterans and historians and that kind of thing to kind of diversify things up a little bit. This time, he's going to tell you about one of his favorite subjects, the Great Beefsteak Raid of 1864. That was possibly the biggest cattle rustling incident in U.S. history, and it was executed by South Carolina's own, Columbia's own, Wade Hampton III. And I'm just going to turn it over to Joe at this point. I don't know if you need this or not, but here it is.
Okay, I usually think I don't, and then somebody in the back usually thinks I do.
Okay, well, it's right here.
Leave it there, and if you are having trouble hearing me, just raise a hand. But I think the fact that they're on will be enough to pick up my voice. So, thank you all for coming out today, and yeah, this is one of my favorite subjects. I think it's just a great story with a lot of good lessons in it. And in case I forget to say as we go on, there are a lot of great books and one, in my opinion, terrible movie. My understanding is another movie is in the works that might be closer to the events, but also very low budget, so we'll see when that pops up. But among the great books, the one I will call on the most today is Edward Boykin's Great Beefsteak Raid. And one of the reasons I will call on that a lot is that Boykin really could turn a phrase and was a really good storyteller. But hopefully you'll want to follow up on this. I did choose the topic partly because of the proximity of the date. The Great Beefsteak Raids operations would kick off more or less on September the 14th and take about 3 days in the autumn of 1864. Now, a little scene setting for the autumn of 1864 for the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia. The armies we think about usually first, most people, the ones that made the big pop culture splash and memory of the war: General Grant's Union Army and General Lee's Confederate Army. And 1864, in the autumn, things have settled into a very static situation. It is becoming more and more a preview of the trench warfare of World War I. Both armies are heavily dug in. The lines are very static. General Lee has defeated superior numbers under commander after commander who have come up against him. General Lee is a master of mobility. General Grant is the first overall commander of the Union Army who understands what his army's strengths are and how to use them. Lee is a boxer. Grant is a wrestler. When he gets contact with the Confederate Army, he's not going to let go. He is going to gain and maintain contact and keep the pressure on using superior numbers. He has said, "We will fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." The result is a bogged down situation. Mobility and the cavalry. Rudyard Kipling put it terrifically in a poem, pointing out, in a poem called The Lesson about the Boer War, he pointed out that men have 2 legs and horses 4, and 2 into 4 goes twice, and nothing over except our lesson, and very cheap at the price. Well, the advantage of the cavalry is mobility. If you're not using the mobility, you're giving away your advantage. It's like being a fighter pilot, and maybe that's why the great cavalry commander personality and the typical fighter pilot personality, the Venn diagram has a big overlap there, have to be bold and decisive to use that mobility effectively. Otherwise, if you're too cautious, you give away the main advantage your troops have. In this bogged down warfare of 1864, though, the cavalry's been changing. On the left here, some of you all recognize James Ewell Brown Stewart. And Stewart, one team name they've forgotten to change because they don't understand it, is the Virginia Cavaliers. Stewart is a Cavalier. Stewart is a terrific cavalry commander in so many ways. And the thing about being very bold and decisive is you also wind up, if you're around long enough, with one giant blunder or more to your discredit. Somebody brings up Admiral Halsey. Somebody says, "But," and talks about the naval battle of the Philippines at Leyte Gulf. And if somebody brings up Stewart, "But Gettysburg." Well, but Gettysburg is far in the past in 1864. But Stewart, while he was commander of the Confederate cavalry, especially at the outset, they enjoyed a big set of advantages. Better horses. This is because Southern cavalry soldiers in most cases are providing their own horse. This is like the knight who has to own his own charger. More than one, though. And they're really good horses, and you don't commit your personal economy to your branch of service unless you really care about it. You know, the Guard wasn't going to ask me to take my pickup overseas. To volunteer to do that is pretty strong. You know, so the Southern cavalry tended to be highly skilled, very dedicated to the idea of the cavalry. Mark Twain suggested the entire war could be blamed on Sir Walter Scott for writing Ivanhoe, because Southern youth saw themselves as the flower of knighthood and chivalry, and wow, they often lived up to it. Jeb Stuart led the entire Army of Northern Virginia cavalry all the way around the Union Army, literally riding a circle around them, not once but twice during his career. and a flamboyant leadership style. The man had a personal banjo player. It says so on the guy's gravestone. Banjo player to Jeb Stuart. And this was part of his leadership as well. Not everybody's Patton. Some people are MacArthur that are really good leaders, and showmanship was one of the tools that he used and used extensively. He also commanded over the glory days of the Confederate cavalry. About halfway through the war, most people marked the Battle of Brandy Station as the Yanks catching up in cavalry. Those great horses are also irreplaceable horses. Those great riders, they're not easily replaceable either, and within a couple of years of training, that Irish immigrant who was tricked into joining the army right off the boat because they promised him he could ride a horse, well, he's a brave man, but it takes a while to learn how to use this 1,000-pound animal. Halfway through the war, he's begun to learn. Then it begins to tip the other way as the supply of new soldiers and horses keeps getting better. The learning curve has been steep. A great book about the tactics of the war written by a Union officer about 10 years later. He says up front, everything we know about cavalry fighting we learned from the enemy. But we eventually caught up and surpassed them. And weapons, as we see, are also shifting, and the South is relying on what it could issue. The North is beginning to have improvements. Wade Hampton, on the right, has been a brave and efficient cavalry subordinate leader under Jeb Stuart, and he has chafed at that the whole time. Stuart is about 10 years younger than him, a Virginian and a West Pointer. Everybody who isn't both in the Confederate officer corps kind of feels like there's a little bit of a Virginia West Point mafia going on. Now, it's understandable. You're building an army out of nothing with the people you have available. You trust the people you know. So there's a good old boys network, and it takes a while for your quality to shine past the people who were already somewhat of a known quantity. So Hampton has chafed under Stuart's leadership to some extent, and sometimes it's caused genuine friction. Hampton is up for next in succession when Jeb Stuart, as he wrote in a letter from West Point as a mere cadet, the saying, be careful that what you wish for. Stuart wrote that he could imagine nothing more glorious than to be killed leading a cavalry charge. And this happened at Yellow Tavern. Wade Hampton inherits command of the Army of Northern Virginia Cavalry, and he inherits with it a set of challenges that are different from the challenges Stuart had. But he also happens to have a very different mindset than Stuart, and so I really like what an officer who served with both of them said about it. By the way, I caught one howling error in the book, The Great Beefsteak Raid, and it happens to involve one of my personal obsessions. In the book, Boykin, either through a misprint or a lost decimal place, or a medieval level of legend believing, said that Wade Hampton's sword weighed 12 pounds. No. But other than that, his description, Hampton was 46, 15 years Stuart's senior, when he became the ranking cavalry commander. He was no knight errant. Gone was the hilarity that kept Stuart's camp in an uproar. Dead was minstrel Sam Sweeney, who tickled his banjo and sang ditties for the fun-loving Stuart. No midnight serenades, no impromptu balls in the wee hours. War was a deadly business in which he was a flaming leader, but he hated it. To his sister, and all of his best letters we still have are to his sister. I suspect I know why. See, Wade's sense of humor could be very puckish and a little bit edgy. His wife chose to burn most of their personal letters. In any case, to his sister, we gain successes, but after every fight there comes to me an ominous paper marked casualties, killed and wounded. Sad words which carry anguish to so many hearts, and we have scarcely time to bury the dead as we press on in the same deadly strife. I pray for peace. I would not give peace for all the military glory won by Bonaparte. Glory might be said to have been one of Jeb Stuart's driving motivations. I don't mean that to his discredit. It's been true of a lot of great commanders. Hampton was a grown-up who wanted to get the war over with and go home. As a result, this is from an officer who served with both of them. Horseman must have been timid and laggard indeed not to have felt the stimulus and inspiration of his dash and gestures as he galloped forward. I saw him leading his division at Gettysburg. No cooler man in the heat and rush of combat ever wielded a sword than Wade Hampton. But the men soon discovered a vast difference between the old and the new. General Stuart would attempt his work with whatever force he had in hand, and often seemed to try to accomplish a given result with the smallest possible number of men. If you do that, the share of glory is greater for all. General Hampton always endeavored to carry every available man to the point of operation, and the larger his force, the better he liked it. The advantage of his style of generalship was soon apparent. Wade Hampton wants to get the war over with and go home. That's the background. And there's a history marker there of the operation we're talking about today that became known as the Great Beefsteak Raid. And I'm grateful to the cigar company that came up with and marketed all these images of great Confederate generals. I've got a matching one actually of General Kosciuszko, the Polish general, by the same company. So Wade Hampton's focus is not glory. Let's look at what it was. You see, when Jeb Stuart rode behind enemy lines, he captured headlines. The one time that Hampton did that in a serious, large operational fashion, he captured dinner. And I've reached the age where, to me too, dinner seems more attractive than headlines. Boykin quotes a Confederate soldier from a letter he discovered. How seldom were you seen? How welcome your presence. In the generous pot you parted with your mysterious strength and sweetness. Impaled upon the cruel ramrod, you suffered slow torture over the fire. Sliced, chopped, and pounded, boiled, stewed, fried, or broiled. Always a trusty friend and sweet comforter. You've been going without beef for a while when you are that nostalgic for it. And an army does march on its stomach, and part of the plan of General Grant's eventually successful attrition warfare is to hit the Confederate Army in its logistics, always its weakest point. Now, the Confederacy has most of the good beef land in the nation. The beef basket, as it were, of the Confederacy is actually not Texas, but Florida, cattle country at that time. But transport to the front is generally the biggest difficulty of anything in the Confederate supply line. If John Hunt Morgan tears up some railroads in the north, it's inconvenient for weeks. If railroads are torn up in the south, that's it. There's no replacing that. The South had about 1 mile of track being produced every year. That's not enough for basic maintenance. So, meat on the hoof, really, really attractive stuff. So we have this situation in 1864, and Lee is speaking to his new cavalry commander, who doesn't have that same reputation, but he's solid. Especially at Gettysburg, his performance is legendary. And Lee says, I need a demonstration in the enemy's rear. We are in a static position, the cavalry, if you can get around the flank and do something that grabs his attention, that's what I need. And Hampton takes this into his mind, and at the same time gets a report from a scout. Now, he had his personal best recon guys, their nickname, they called them Hampton's Iron Scouts. And one of the Iron Scouts, now the Iron Scouts would operate, this was not a formal thing, you didn't get a cool badge on your uniform, none of that. It was a nickname you earned over time by being on these operations where you might spend days behind enemy lines. You might use completely illegal dodges that would get you executed if captured, like wearing civilian clothes or a Union uniform. The North did this as well. My wife's ancestors' commander was famous for using what he called the Jesse Scouts. And this is like a guy in World War II that goes on a recon mission. You understand 100%. When I put on this enemy uniform, I am no longer a lawful combatant. If captured, I will be executed. That was just part of their lives. But one of these guys, Shadburn, George Shadburn, would come to Wade Hampton with a very interesting report. Near Blackwater, 5th September 1864. General, I have just returned from City Point. The defenses are as follows. And then he gives some description of the defenses of City Point in some detail. Stole this map, by the way. One of my other slides does have the footnote that you can use to find the original source for it. But you see the Union and Confederate lines up there near Petersburg. That's the static area. Shadburn has gotten back in here, scouted around. City Point is up there. It's not quite on the map. It's where the river is turning right there. And he has looked at the potential defenses here and discovered the cattle corral seems to be a vulnerability. At Coggins Point, he writes, also known as City Point, are 3,000 beeves, beef cattle, attended by 120 men and 30 citizens without arms. At Sycamore Church is 1 regiment of cavalry, the 1st District of Columbia. This is the nearest point of the picket line to Coggins Point, about 2 miles. The greatest danger, I think, would be on the Jerusalem Plank Road. Then he shows where the different corps are and just throws in a note about a couple of the enemy commanders, the kind of thing he overhears hiding behind a tree. Butler has just returned from political convention. This is Benjamin Butler returning from a political meeting he'd gone to. It is thought more cavalry is about returning. Colonel Blank is under arrest for drunkenness. Your obedient servant, Shadburn. So, Wade sits down and goes over this, and then goes back to General Lee saying, remember how I was going to make a demonstration so that you can do something? Sir, I'd like to reverse that. Can you get all the guys out of the trenches and make preparations for an assault so that they'll think I'm a distraction? Because, sir, I'm not going to be a distraction. I'm going to go steal all their beef. It's a bold plan, but the Union is relying largely on the Blackwater Creek, where the bridge has been destroyed, and on the 1st District of Columbia Cavalry. They are kind of a pet unit. The 1st District of Columbia Cavalry has not seen a lot of action, but they do get all the best stuff, and they've got a lot of connections. They're prominent. They've been in more parades than battles. And, you know, there's an old military saying, and I'm sure that Ben can attest to the truth of it. They say no inspection-ready unit has ever been combat-ready, and no combat-ready unit has ever been inspection-ready. Yeah. So the obstacles here, of course, if it's figured out too early on, the Confederacy is going to be trapped, or the Hampton's horsemen are going to be trapped behind enemy lines. But if he can pull this off to an army on short rations, it's going to be a tremendous coup. There is no picture of the critical bridge, so, you know, it's a no copyright picture of a bridge. The bridge over the Blackwater has got to be created in a hurry, and this is going to be a critical part of the operation. A young engineer with the last name Lanau. I'm trying to find out more about this man. Some Lanaus of Huguenot descent in South Carolina. One of them had been a Citadel graduate in 1856. I can't find it. This is the same guy. I couldn't find a photograph of him anywhere. We've got a man here with an engineering insignia on his cap, and he can attest the engineers never get due credit. It's going to be Lanau's job to put down a bridge over the swollen creek, basically overnight. In order, it has to be a bridge that not only can the cavalry cross, but that they can bring, hopefully, 3,000 cattle back across in a hurry. And so the construction of this bridge from The History of the Laurel Brigade by Captain MacDonald. The first night, the whole force bivouacked near Wilkinson's Bridge. Early next morning, the march was continued. The region through which the expedition passed was flat and marshy. The road wound around through occasional pine forests that helped conceal their strength. Early in the evening, the Blackwater was reached at a point where Cook's Bridge, recently destroyed, had stood. Hampton purposely took this route because of the absence of a bridge, averting any suspicion of any approach that way. Here he halted and fed while the Engineer Corps built a new bridge, finishing it before nightfall. At midnight, the column crossed over. So, this was also the point at which the men on the expedition learned what the mission was. It was going to be obvious which way they're going, since they were building a new bridge to go across it, and only then did it actually get out from beyond the scouts and Hampton himself. It's going to be one of his subordinates, Colonel Rosser, who commands in the main actual fight in between the bridge and the cattle corral. And that is going to be General Rosser. Now, some sources call this Ebenezer Church. That's very confusing because there's a different Battle of Ebenezer Church in Alabama. Sycamore is also used. In either case, this is the guy who's going to be commanding direct attack straight into the 1st District of Columbia Cavalry, and it's General Tom Rosser. Well, Tom is pretty young. He left West Point 2 weeks before graduation in 1861. And now, 4 years later, he is serving as a brigadier general, and he's going to make major general before the war is over. Rosser had grown up on farms, first in Virginia, but later in Texas. presumably a ranch. It was 640 acres. At age 13, when Dad couldn't go along with the family relocating to Texas, was going to catch up with them later, the 13-year-old son was put in charge of the wagon train. He took the family and the extensive entourage out to Texas. George Armstrong Custer was his West Point roommate. And among his distinctions, General Rosser is the only Confederate that I know of with an aerial shoot-down credit. Having shot down one, as an artillerist, he shot down one of McClellan's observation balloons. 4 more and he could have been an ace. He also, after being in cavalry command, occasionally exchanged notes with his old roommate. In fact, he sent him a note and a little package after capturing some stuff from a supply wagon belonging to Custer's cavalry. He sent him a note. "Dear Fanny," he called Custer, "you may have made me take a few steps back today. I will be even with you tomorrow. Please accept my good wishes. And this little gift, a pair of your drawers captured at Trevilian Station." Tex. Custer replied, by the way, sending Tom Rosser's coat to Rosser's wife with a note saying, "I captured this coat. Please tell your tailor next time to make the following alterations." So the guys kept needling each other in between these ferocious fights. Custer's not going to be there at Ebenezer Church. These guys are. And you see these cavalry to guard the District of Columbia. They look like, to me, a inspection-ready unit. The inspector would be particularly impressed with the new 16-shot Henry repeating rifles, which have been issued to the cavalry. Now, I said I'd say something about the change in arms changing the cavalry. For some reason, the Union decided to prioritize giving repeating weapons to the cavalry. And the Henry is the latest and the greatest. You can still get a Henry of very much that same design, and it's still a pretty good rifle. Confederates quickly nicknamed the Henrys and Spencers that blamed Yankee gun you load on Sunday that shoots all week. And it represented quite a disparity in weapons. By the way, this actually is one of the Henrys from that particular unit that was in an auction site. Wade Hampton will write after the war, "Many of my men were armed with," he called them artillery carbines, "no better than the bows and arrows of the savages." So he didn't have a great affection for the pattern 1856 Enfield carbine. It's a good, reliable, slow, inaccurate weapon. It simply had become outdated. It's also not very accurate because of its short barrel, and Wade led marksmen. He actually encouraged his soldiers, when possible, to unofficially ditch this and get themselves an infantry musket and carry an Enfield pattern 1853 if they could get one, because he preferred to either have his men dismount and fight behind cover, or to close all the way to saber distance. That's his. It doesn't weigh 12 pounds. We had to give that one back after a period when we borrowed it, but I had to get a photo with that one first. It's got the impact marks on it from Hampton. The fight at Ebenezer Church, or Sycamore Church, is going to be a close quarters operation. They are going to try to close on and overwhelm the District of Columbia cavalry before they can really get alert, and certainly before that disparity of firepower can come into play. And Rosser's going to be very effective at this indeed. Give me a moment while I grab the right description. No discredit accrues to the commander, regimental commander that day of the District of Columbia Cavalry. Things were somewhat set up against him. Rosser turned to Colonel Massey. "Go in hard," to his bugler. "Give him a charge." With a wild, ringing yell, 2 squadrons of the 12th Virginia thundered up the dark road. It was like dashing against a black wall spouting Roman candles. The 1st District was firing point blank, but they emptied saddles. Emboldened troopers leapt to the ground, ran to the barricade, and began pulling at the obstructions in the gap. In a black tangle of trampling hoofs, the 12th Virginia drew back. Had there been light enough to see what they were shooting at, the 1st District would have decimated the great charge. Rosser's booming voice rose above the confusion. He was at his best in times like these. "Colonel Massey, try it again. We've got to clear the road, and clear it fast." "Use your pistols, men," shouted Rosser as the troops pounded past. They rode in at a straining gallop. Wheeling, they came back, but not all of them. There was no formation. Taking their losses, 3 dead, 15 wounded, they worked fast, tugging at the blockade under the vicious ratapan of repeating rifles. Other men ran unseen to the right and left, stealing round the sides. A trooper came running back. "It's open wide enough for an elephant." Rosser ordered the 7th to stand fast and pour fire into the gap until he brought up the rest of his squadrons for the breakthrough. It took 10 minutes to line them up. Rosser rode along the line. "Use your sabers, men. Ride through and cut them down." Sabering bluecoats right and left, the gray onrush crowded and floundered through the now widened gap, losing formation but getting through, flooding out over the camp on both sides of the road, flushing out men still asleep, setting fire to rows of tents. The sheer weight of the onslaught was overwhelming, but the 1st District made a fight of it. The blue troopers might as well have tried to stop an avalanche. The 1st District's commander, Major J. Stannard Baker, dashed out of his tent in the gray light at the first crack of gunfire and stood with his men, pistol in hand and firing, until the tide came pouring through the barricade. He was trying to rally his men when a saber struck him a glancing blow on the head, opening a gash inches long. His legs crumpled. He sank unconscious to the ground to be left for dead. Hampton rode up. He had one word for Rosser: magnificent. The fight at the barricade had taken just half an hour. Caught by Rosser's men sweeping through the camp were 4 sutlers' wagons. These wartime profiteers had hitched up their mules to dash for safety with their precious loads when the gray fury overtook them. They made an ill-advised show of resistance and were cut down on the spot, their wagons overturned, spilling out their contents: pickles, sardines, cheese, cakes, candy, cigars, even a few bottles of champagne. Rosser's gaunt soldiery pawed through the luxuries like ravenous wolves, taking everything with them, down to the last bit of candy. No time to count prisoners. Major Riles Provost herded them and reckoned about 300. He wasn't far wrong. Over 200 16 shooters, gifts to the regiment by, quote, the loyal women of Washington and Georgetown, strewed the road, tossed away as if they were red-hot pokers. Several hundred horses and mules were taken, munching breakfast, unaware they had changed masters. Company cooks were ordered to keep on cooking, but double the portions. So, great success against the only force that was really in place to do anything about this raid, and the District of Columbia Cavalry was outnumbered here by Hampton's concentration of forces. Interestingly, one source insists they had only 150 men there, and has no answer for how 300 prisoners were taken. You got to watch commanders after the action and their commentary. And that's why it's so fun to study a war in which after-action reports from both sides are available and in the same language. You'll find out both sides were usually outnumbered. In this case, it was the 1st District of Columbia outnumbered and more or less destroyed as an effective fighting force for the rest of the war. But we're just getting to the important part. And one of the many contributions of that scout, Shadburn, was bringing along a contingent of dogs. Dogs trained to herd cattle. As they came upon the much more poorly defended corral itself, primarily civilians who were drovers there, but some of them pulled their revolvers and attempted to resist anyway. A score drew their Colts, hoping perhaps to rally the fleeing troopers of the 13th Pennsylvania and remnants of the 1st District, which Rosser had driven before him. Then, as if by common accord, the herd stampeded. In a pandemonium of thundering hooves and fierce bellowing, 2,500-odd steers bolted out of their freeze and cavorted across the pasture. The early sunlight glinted on the tips of thousands of sharp horns. Captain Richardson, U.S. Army, gives a vivid picture. The enemy came up shooting and firing with great vehemence, driving before them numbers of the 1st District of Columbia Cavalry and the 13th Pennsylvania. By the time the fence was pulled down and 20 cattle out, mules and dismounted horses, mingled with retreating cavalrymen, were fleeing from the enemy. The enemy was nearly around the whole herd. I saw that all was lost. He takes off. Within a mile, we met another strong force of the enemy charging up to us and firing upon us. You can see that is Fitzhugh Lee's guys taking off to the side. And there's a lot we have to skip in such a brief introduction. I wheeled my horse and came back a quarter of a mile. The enemy pressing up, I turned into the woods. Not over 15 minutes elapsed from the time I received word the lines had been attacked until my camp, with the cattle, was in possession of the enemy. Some of my men had not time to saddle their horses before they were prisoners. Outside of and independent to this line of attack, the enemy held the Telegraph Road running to Fort Powhatan by the James River. 5 of the herders lay dead, 10 others wounded or captured. The fight at the corral was not a rout, but a wipeout, child's play for Rosser's boys. Shadburn's hound dogs were having their day, too. Their baying rose above the bedlam of gunfire and bawling of maddened steers. So it's just daylight now, and the capture has been made. Now they've got about 2,500 cattle to get back over that hastily constructed bridge. So the confusion within the lines at this very bold and unexpected act, you've got messages chasing all over. But, and this is one of those leadership lessons every bureaucracy could learn, there are actually officers making excuses and talking about why they aren't at fault faster than there are orders to begin a pursuit to try to stop and recapture the cattle. People are immediately sending out "it's not my fault" messages, and their personal reputations and careers, they feel, are very much at risk. Well, of course they are. This is humiliating. But that should not be priority number one. And forces are put together to try a hasty pursuit and harassment. It doesn't really wind up amounting to much. And we think of these guys as being, we have a certain picture of the soldier of the war, and part of it is because the photograph's taken, you have to sit still for a period of time for the photograph. The photographer would say, relax your face, so that changing your expression didn't mess up the photograph. So we think of them all as so dour. As the first Union troops are coming up to find a burning bridge with the cattle already gone on the other side of it, some Confederates have hung around in the woods on the other side in order to go, moo! I like to think George Shadburn was among them because he just seems like the kind of guy who might have done that. But there's not a lot of good news in the South that September. And it's only going to get worse from then on. But that means that something like this that is worthy of Stuart's glory days, you know, the old headlines, General Stuart rides all the way around the Union Army, pursued by his father-in-law. That had been fun. But there's a little rhyme that used to be used to teach the progress of the war from the Southern point of view. 61 was a lot of fun. 62, a lot to do. 63, followed General Lee. 64, tired of the war. And 65, just glad to be alive. Well, they're tired of the war, and news about meat going to their relatives is actually very encouraging indeed to Southern civilians. This is from the Richmond Examiner, September 20th, 1864. Hampton's dash upon the enemy near Petersburg. We have had some particulars of Hampton's brilliant dash upon the enemy, in which he captured 2,500 head of cattle, 300 prisoners, many arms and wagons, and etc. At an early hour Wednesday morning, General Hampton, with W.H.F. Lee's division, Rosser's and Deering's brigades, and Graham's and McGregor's batteries of artillery, newspapers. Those batteries of artillery, as far as I know, were not in full. Struck tents and started on his expedition. The attack was a surprise to the enemy. Their position was carried with a rush. The charge of our men at both points is represented to have been faultless. So sudden and rapid was the assault, the Yankees rushed from their tents en dishabille, in their underwear, and were enabled to make comparatively feeble resistance. The enemy having been completely routed and demoralized, it was determined to push ahead at once. There was no difficulty in securing the cattle. In another place, I thought it was this article, but it's in my description here. By the way, terrific. Mort Kunstler is absolutely terrific artist of the war, and this is his depiction of the crossing. It's not this crossing because they don't have a bridge. The Richland Examiner, in another article, is going to gloat about just how much is involved here. 2,486 beeves were captured. They estimate 800 pounds of beef per, coming out to almost 2 million pounds of beef, as well as 11 wagons, and very important to them, 3 guidons. There's a flag in our museum that a descendant of the 5th Cavalry made it his life's, a lifetime goal of his, eventually achieved, was to get the flag of the 5th back from the West Point Museum and into the relic room, because the Michigan troopers who captured that flag had been bragging about it, even though it was an extra flag captured in a wagon that was miles away from the 5th Cavalry at the time. It still rankled. So come see it when we're open again and get the chance. But again, Wade Hampton wasn't trying to capture headlines, but dinner, and was magnificently successful in this. leaving me a couple of minutes to talk about that movie. The movie Alvarez Kelly. If you're a movie fan, that's one thing, and if you're a history fan, it's another. Raise your hand if you're a history person it's difficult to watch movies with and others don't want to be in the room with you for a movie. Come on, some of y'all admit it. You know, that the storytelling can be one thing. The movie Alvarez Kelly does not pretend to exactly follow the events of the Beefsteak Raid, so they can't be blamed for that. But often a movie reflects the time that it's made in and its sensibilities much, much more than the time it's actually portraying. And this one came out in 1966. And in the film, unusually for a film of this type, the hero of the movie, Alvarez Kelly, is a Mexican. And in the storyline of the movie, he has been hired to deliver cattle to the Union Army. And he gets captured by the Confederates. And then, because they're planning a beefsteak raid, they want to force him to use his cattle herding expertise on their side. And in the course of trying to force him to do that, they not only imprison him, but Colonel Rosser shoots one of his fingers off and tells him he's coming back every day to shoot off another finger until he agrees. And so Alvarez Kelly does the thing, but he comes to like the Confederates he's working with, and then he steals the colonel's girl at the end of the movie. Okay, movies. My difficulty here, two big things about Colonel Rosser. First of all, he was not a one-eyed sadistic war criminal who shot people's fingers off. This was not the kind of person Colonel Rosser was. If they wanted to make up a villain for the movie, give the man a fake name. Don't destroy the reputation. But the other part of the movie, I think part of the era they're in, Gone with the Wind was the definitive movie about how to think about the war in many ways for their generation. And so this is a movie saying, yeah, but man, it was actually a lot harsher than that. And, you know, so instead of having bells on the plantation, Kelly is interacting with women, desperate women in bordellos. That's reality in war. It's a terrible thing that happened to a lot of people. But the idea they have from Gone with the Wind is that the Confederate cavalry might be good at fighting on horseback as if they've studied Napoleon a lot, but they're kind of effete gentlemen who don't know how to do blue-collar stuff. So in the movie, Colonel Rosser doesn't know how to herd cattle, and neither does anybody else in the whole cavalry. They all have to be taught by cowboys. These guys are the cowboys. This man grew up on a ranch in Texas and led a wagon train when he was 13. So that is a plot device in there that's really kind of annoying because, yeah, these guys absolutely knew how to herd cattle. And the bit with the scout that recommended and brought the cattle herding dogs to make sure that the whole thing went well, you know, so in defense of Colonel Rosser's reputation, I'm going to say a new movie needs to be made about the Beefsteak Raid, and you know, do it more correctly with lack of war criminals, and with a little more understanding that just because the Confederate cavalry soldier at the beginning of the war often did have a thoroughbred horse, and often was upper middle class or above. Because if you're a regular guy with a small farm and you have a horse, you're going off to war, my wife needs that horse. The farm needs that horse. I'll walk. It's only if you had multiple riding horses and you were particularly attached to the idea of riding them into battle that you went into the cavalry. So they did tend to be upper class. That did not mean that their lives were easy and they had no blue-collar skills. I would not trade with Wade Hampton's lifestyle and the amount of hard work he had to do, despite being one of the richest men in the nation of his time. For one thing, I'm enjoying the air conditioning right now. So, to wrap up, oh, by the way, Rosser becomes a United States general in the Spanish-American War. He is not assigned overseas. He is assigned to train our cavalry. So if they had needed to steal any cows in Cuba, they would have been good with that part of the mission as well. But training the cavalry, of course, that would include a certain New York fellow with very thick eyeglasses, Theodore Roosevelt. Wade Hampton, of course, is going to go on to his own distinguished career after the war. Here's a picture of him and another veteran. That's probably on the front porch of the Tolbert House, which is still standing in Cashiers, North Carolina. And there are apparently 14 pages of official records taken up with people blame shifting about what had gone wrong. A couple of the stories there, the Washington Star. The correspondent of the New York Tribune wires from the front at Petersburg claiming all our cattle captured by the enemy from the James River were recaptured by our cavalry. We regret to say the Tribune correspondent is not well informed. We have recaptured precisely one bullock, an unfortunate animal with a broken leg, whose fearful bellowings in a piece of woods attracted our cavalry to the place. The woods, having been carefully reconnoitered, surrounded, and penetrated, the recapture above was successfully made. The cattle account therefore stands. Captured by the enemy, 2,487. Recaptured, 1. Nor could Grant himself refrain from bestowing some laurels. He recognized Hampton's feat. In reporting his loss, he recorded the enemy's cavalry under General Hampton got in behind us and drove off a large number of beef cattle. It was a fair capture, much needed by the Confederates. After the furor had died down, Grant invited several high officers, including General Kautz, who'd actually been in charge of the security for that area, to dine with him at his headquarters. Following a beefless meal, cigars were handed around, smoke curled upwards. Presently a guest ventured a leading question. General, how long will it take you to starve out Lee and capture Richmond? Grant flicked the ashes from his Savannah and replied quietly, forever, if you keep feeding Lee's army with beef. Cheeks reddened. Whose? Nobody ever said. Grant kept puffing. But from President Lincoln came the aptest description of Hampton's beefsteak raid. It was the slickest piece of cattle stealing I ever heard of. So, it's a great story. I think there's a lot to learn from it. And all over the South for years afterwards, old soldiers remembered suddenly having a food supply. I think it also stuck in General Grant's head. General Grant later becoming President Grant. During the end of President Grant's administration, we had the wildest, craziest election this state has ever seen. I hope I never see anything like the 1876 election. We've seen craziness, but over 100 people were killed in this state in violence between the parties that year, primarily over the governorship. And when both sides claimed they won and were called to Washington to explain themselves, well, Wade Hampton is going to be the candidate who is certified by the Republicans as the guy who is able to restore some form of order in the state and be competent in pulling things together and honorable in his performance of doing so. think part of that is that the departing President Grant is certainly part of the decision-making process there. And he is one of the people who's going to say, you know, that's a man who knows how to do his job. And he does not do things in an excessive and obnoxious, but a very pragmatic way. We've all seen previous governors' administration fall apart. And I can't prove that. I can't prove that. If I was the movie writer, that would be the last scene. Because, you know, in Hollywood, they don't have to be responsible. But just speculating, I'm thinking that Wade Hampton's leadership in this raid might be something that was also remembered at the highest levels of a Republican administration 10 years later, which is going to certify the new Democrat governor of South Carolina when they can't get honest numbers out of either side and have to do something. So I hope the wild speculation at the end didn't ruin your curiosity to learn more about this great operation. The Great Beefsteak Raid by Edward Boykin, if you can find it. That's older, it might be harder to get. There's some great biographies of Wade Hampton. There are some good recent books about the Iron Scouts, and if you do a keyword search with the Iron Scouts, you want to pick up some good stuff there. And there are specifics, at least some books about the cavalry operations in the Petersburg campaign. Those are some more keywords you can use to get further than my introductory talk was here about the Great Beefsteak Raid of 1864. Anybody have any questions? Yes?
I think the second slide you had that historical marker. Where is that?
Yeah, if you can, it is up in the Petersburg area. Have you seen it personally?
Yeah, I've seen that.
If you'll shoot me an email at work, it's going to be out for a week after this talk. But then I will get back to you, and I can find online the actual GPS coordinates if you want.
Which one is Hampton?
Oh, Hampton is on the left. By this time, with the dog. By this time, one of Wade Hampton's feet is wooden, but he does not like to show that in photographs, so he's wearing a normal boot on it. But yeah, all of his life, Wade, except one very brief period in the Army, he wore a full beard. I think just because maybe it was easier in the field to not shave at all. But all the rest of his life, as soon as he got facial hair, he went into some variation of the mutton chop and he kept it forever. All of his pictures have that mutton chop look too. Yes?
Just as a side comment, Joe, as a historian all my life, I have the same heartburn that you do over movies, and they're either destroying or altering history so badly. But as a great director once pointed out, we're not making documentaries, kid.
Right.
So
Right.
they've been 120 years of altering history, but it's not a documentary.
Well, you know, my saying, because I like entertainment. Okay, you know, you can put this one down as Joe's rule. Maybe this would be my legacy. History on screen should always be regarded as a commercial for history books. I mean, it's great that it arouses our interest, and it does not answer our questions. And I forgave the Rough Riders TNT people for casting Gary Busey as Joe Wheeler. But yeah, they always do something.
My personal vendetta is more recent. It's I lecture on the Doolittle Raid and its relationship to Columbia. And the movie Pearl Harbor, when it came out, the writers and directors decided they didn't want to end the movie on the sour note of the defeat at Pearl Harbor. So they ridiculously worked in the Doolittle Raid as if Doolittle came and recruited two pilots who flew fighters and immediately threw them in a bomber and off they went. And the end of the movie butchers the Doolittle Raid. And I've never forgiven him for that. I've never watched it again. But that's
My boys have played more accurate video games about World War II aviation than 90% of World War II aviation movies they get. So, I'm with you. Brothers in spirit there. Well, thank you all very much for deciding to spend some of your